Standing in that packed courthouse, watching my own mother point an accusatory finger at me while my father nodded in agreement, I felt something break inside my chest. These were the same people who had tucked me into bed every night as a child, who had celebrated my every achievement, who had promised to love me unconditionally. Now they sat across the aisle, with their expensive lawyer arguing that I was too incompetent to inherit the $4.7 million my grandfather had left me. Their reasoning was brutally simple and publicly humiliating. Growing up in our cozy three-bedroom house on Maple Street in Springfield, Ohio, I never questioned whether my parents loved me. Thomas and Barbara had created what felt like the perfect American family. Dad worked as a regional sales manager for an automotive parts company, while Mom taught third grade at the local elementary school. Our evenings were filled with homework help at the kitchen table, weekend barbecues in the backyard, and family game nights that stretched past my bedtime. My grandfather Samuel was the family enigma. He would disappear for months at a time on mysterious business trips, sending postcards from places like Singapore, Mumbai, and Sao Paulo. When he returned, his suitcases bulged with exotic gifts, and his pockets jingled with foreign coins that he let me examine under my bedroom lamp. Samuel never talked much about his work, only saying he helped companies import specialty items from overseas. What made Samuel special was how he treated our family time as sacred. During his visits, he would sit on our front porch swing for hours, teaching me card games and sharing stories about different cultures. He never seemed rushed or distracted, even though I knew important business calls were waiting. Samuel had this way of making me feel like I was the most important person in the world during those conversations. Our Sunday dinners became legendary events when Samuel was home. Mom would spend hours preparing his favorite pot roast with carrots and potatoes, while Dad would break out his good wine and share stories about work challenges. Samuel would listen intently, offering quiet advice that always seemed to solve whatever problem Dad was facing. These meals felt like celebrations of our family bond. I remember one particular conversation when I was 16, sitting on the porch swing as fireflies danced around our yard. Samuel asked about my plans after high school, and I mentioned thinking about studying law. His eyes lit up with genuine excitement as he talked about the importance of education and integrity in any profession. He made me promise to always stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult or costly. The academic achievements came naturally to me. High school valedictorian led to a full scholarship at Ohio State University, where I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in political science. My parents beamed with pride at every milestone, taking pictures and sharing my accomplishments with everyone in our neighborhood. They drove 6 hours to attend my college graduation ceremony, staying in an expensive hotel they could barely afford just to celebrate my success. When I received my acceptance letter to Harvard Law School, our house erupted in celebration. Mom actually cried tears of joy while Dad called his entire office to share the news. Samuel happened to be visiting that week, and I will never forget the look of pure pride on his weathered face as he hugged me. He whispered that I was going to do great things and make a real difference in the world. The 3 years at Harvard were challenging but rewarding. I threw myself into constitutional law and criminal procedure, earning recognition for academic excellence and landing a spot on the Harvard Law Review. My parents visited Cambridge twice, touring the campus with wonder and taking endless photos of me in front of every historic building. They seemed genuinely amazed that their son was studying at such a prestigious institution. Graduation from Harvard Law felt like the culmination of everything our family had worked toward. Samuel made a rare exception to attend the ceremony, sitting between my parents in the crowded auditorium. The photo of the 4 of us outside Harvard Yard remains one of my most treasured possessions. Samuel looked frail but happy, while my parents glowed with parental satisfaction. After passing the bar exam with high scores, I received multiple job offers from prestigious law firms in Boston, New York, and Chicago. The starting salaries were impressive, and the career prospects seemed limitless. Samuel was particularly excited about my opportunities, saying he had always known I would achieve great things through hard work and determination. Then, everything changed 3 months ago when Samuel collapsed while visiting our house. The heart attack came without warning during what should have been a routine family dinner. Dad performed CPR while we waited for the ambulance, but Samuel was pronounced dead at Springfield Memorial Hospital 2 hours later. The man who had been such a stabilizing force in our family was suddenly gone, leaving behind a void that felt impossible to fill. The funeral service drew hundreds of people I had never seen before. Apparently, Samuel had touched many lives through his business dealings and quiet philanthropy. As we stood beside his casket, I noticed my parents having hushed conversations with several men in expensive suits who looked distinctly uncomfortable in our small-town funeral parlor. At the time, I assumed these were business associates paying their respects. Samuel's lawyer, James Peterson, approached our family after the service to schedule a will reading for the following week. He mentioned that Samuel had been very specific about the timing and circumstances of this meeting. My parents exchanged glances that seemed meaningful, but I was too grief-stricken to pay attention to subtle family dynamics. The surprise came 2 weeks after the funeral when I accidentally overheard a phone conversation my parents thought I could not hear. Mom was in the kitchen talking to someone, her voice barely above a whisper, but the words that reached my ears made my blood run cold. She mentioned something about phase 2 of the plan, and how my temporary job situation would provide perfect leverage for their strategy. I stood frozen in the hallway, straining to catch more details. Dad joined the conversation, and I heard him reference my current employment status as evidence of poor judgment and financial irresponsibility. They discussed timeline concerns and the importance of acting quickly before I could establish any financial stability or legal representation. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. These people who had raised me, who had celebrated every success and comforted every failure, had been planning some kind of scheme involving my future since before Samuel was even buried. They were discussing my life as if I were a business problem to be solved rather than their beloved son. I quietly backed away from the kitchen and went to my bedroom, my mind racing with questions and fears. What plan were they implementing? What did my job have to do with anything? And most terrifyingly, how long had they been viewing me as some kind of obstacle or opportunity rather than their child? The trust that had anchored my entire worldview began crumbling that night as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what I had overheard. The loving family I thought I knew was apparently capable of deception and manipulation on a scale I could never have imagined. The truth about my current employment situation requires some explanation because it represents the most painful betrayal of all. I am indeed working as a waiter at Millfield's Restaurant, a family-style establishment near our house that serves decent food to local families and travelers passing through Springfield. But this job was never supposed to be permanent, and the circumstances that led me here were carefully orchestrated by people I trusted completely. After graduating from Harvard Law and passing the bar exam, I received offers from 3 prestigious law firms. Morrison Klein and Associates in Boston offered me a starting salary of $160,000 plus benefits to join their corporate law division. Hartwell and Partners in New York proposed $175,000 to work in their litigation department. Most exciting was the offer from Gibson Reed and Company in Chicago, where I would have earned $180,000 working on high-profile criminal defense cases. Any of these positions would have launched my legal career with incredible momentum and financial security. The partners at each firm had been impressed with my Harvard credentials and law review experience. Several mentioned that I could expect rapid advancement if I demonstrated the same dedication and intelligence that had earned me academic recognition. But my parents convinced me that accepting any of these opportunities would be selfish and irresponsible given our family circumstances. Samuel's health had been declining over the past year, they explained, and he needed family support during this difficult time. They painted a picture of an elderly man facing his final months alone, while his only grandson chased career ambitions in distant cities. The emotional manipulation was subtle, but effective. Mom would mention how Samuel asked about me during their weekly visits, wondering when I would be coming home to spend time with him. Dad shared stories about Samuel's increasing frailty and confusion, suggesting that my presence might provide comfort during his decline. They made me feel like abandoning Samuel to pursue personal success would be an unforgivable act of selfishness. They also presented practical arguments that seemed reasonable at the time. The cost of living in major cities was astronomical, they pointed out, and my law school debt would be crushing even with a high salary. Staying home temporarily would allow me to save money while providing family support. Samuel had always been generous, they hinted, and he would certainly want to help with my financial situation once he understood my circumstances. Most persuasively, they suggested that gaining some real-world experience outside the legal profession would make me a better lawyer. Understanding how ordinary people lived and worked would give me valuable perspective when representing clients. Many successful attorneys had taken unconventional paths early in their careers, they argued, and this temporary detour might actually enhance my long-term prospects. So I turned down all 3 job offers and moved back into my childhood bedroom. The law firms were understanding with several partners, suggesting I contact them when my family situation stabilized. I felt good about my decision, believing I was demonstrating maturity and family loyalty by putting personal ambition aside for a greater cause. The waiting job at Millfields was supposed to be a short-term solution, while I figured out local legal opportunities. Springfield was not exactly a hotbed of legal activity, but I thought I might find part-time work with a local firm, or perhaps start developing clients for an eventual solo practice. The restaurant job would provide immediate income while I explored these possibilities. What I did not realize was how systematically my parents were sabotaging every attempt I made to advance my legal career. When law firms sent follow-up letters expressing continued interest, those letters mysteriously never reached me. Mom would casually mention that some official-looking mail had arrived, but that it was probably just junk from law school marketing programs. My parents actively discouraged me from networking with local attorneys, claiming it would seem presumptuous for a recent graduate to approach established professionals. They convinced me that Springfield lawyers would resent some hotshot Harvard graduate trying to muscle in on their territory. Better to keep a low profile and let opportunities develop naturally, they advised. When I mentioned wanting to attend bar association events or continuing education seminars, Dad would suddenly remember important family obligations that required my presence. Samuel would need a ride to a medical appointment, or Mom would have planned a special family dinner that I could not miss without hurting feelings. These conflicts always seemed to arise whenever I tried to pursue professional development opportunities. The most insidious part was how they convinced me to downplay my educational background around town. They argued that mentioning Harvard would make me seem arrogant and out of touch with regular folks in Springfield. People would think I was showing off or looking down on them, which would hurt both my social relationships and any future legal practice. Better to blend in and let my character speak for itself, they suggested. This advice seemed wise at the time, so I started introducing myself simply as Joey without mentioning my law degree. At the restaurant, customers and co-workers knew me as just another local guy working to pay the bills. I thought I was being humble and approachable, but I was actually allowing my parents to erase my professional identity. Over the past 2 years, this pattern became my normal routine. I would work shifts at Millfields, come home to have dinner with the family, and spend evenings helping Samuel with various tasks or simply keeping him company. My legal education began feeling like a distant dream rather than a recent accomplishment. The restaurant work itself was not unpleasant. My coworkers were decent people, and many of the regular customers became friendly acquaintances. I learned valuable lessons about customer service and workplace dynamics that would indeed serve me well in any future legal career. But I also watched my Harvard classmates advancing through prestigious firms while I struggled to pay off student loans on minimum wage plus tips. Occasionally, I would mention wanting to revive my legal career, but my parents always had compelling reasons why the timing was wrong. Samuel was having a particularly difficult week and needed extra attention. The local legal market was slow, and it would be better to wait for conditions to improve. My current financial situation would make it difficult to afford the professional wardrobe and networking expenses required for serious job hunting. They were so convincing that I began to doubt my own judgment. Maybe I was being impatient and unrealistic about career expectations. Maybe the smart approach was to wait for perfect circumstances rather than rushing into major decisions. Maybe my parents, with their decades of life experience, understood something about timing and opportunity that I was missing. Looking back now, I can see how carefully they crafted this web of manipulation. Every suggestion seemed reasonable and well-intentioned. Every obstacle appeared to be an unfortunate coincidence rather than deliberate sabotage. They created an environment where I felt guilty for prioritizing personal ambition over family loyalty, while simultaneously ensuring that I remained financially dependent and professionally stagnant. The cruelest part was how they used Samuel as justification for their manipulation. They claimed to be protecting his emotional well-being by keeping me close to home when actually they were positioning me to appear unsuccessful and irresponsible when inheritance issues arose. They transformed my genuine love and respect for Samuel into a weapon against my own future. By the time Samuel passed away, I had been working at Millfields for nearly 2 years, with nothing to show for my Harvard education, except mounting debt and missed opportunities. My parents had successfully created the exact circumstances they would later use to justify their legal challenge. I appeared to be a recent graduate who had failed to launch his career making poor decisions and lacking the judgment necessary to handle significant financial responsibility. The sophistication of their long-term planning still takes my breath away. This was not a spontaneous reaction to unexpected inheritance news. This was a carefully executed strategy that had been developing for years, using my own love and trust against me, while positioning themselves to claim that my apparent failures justified their intervention. The will reading took place on a gray Tuesday morning in James Peterson's modest office on Main Street, just 3 blocks from the courthouse, where this story would eventually reach its climax. The office reflected Samuel's practical nature, with simple furniture and family photos, rather than the intimidating legal atmosphere I might have expected from my Harvard experience. Peterson, a soft-spoken man in his 60s, who had been Samuel's attorney for over 20 years, began by expressing his condolences and explaining the basic structure of Samuel's estate. The will itself was straightforward and clearly written, reflecting the same direct communication style that had characterized Samuel throughout his life. My parents sat stiffly in their chairs as Peterson began reading the specific bequests. Samuel had left $50,000 to each of them, along with full ownership of the family house on Maple Street. This was far more generous than I had expected, given that they were not blood relatives, but rather connected to Samuel only through their marriage to his daughter, who had passed away when I was young. The household items and personal effects were distributed among various family friends and former business associates with specific instructions for preserving certain mementos that held sentimental value. Samuel had clearly spent considerable time thinking about how his possessions should be handled, wanting to ensure that meaningful items went to people who would appreciate their significance. Then Peterson reached the section that would change everything. Samuel had liquidated his entire business operation over the past 5 years, quietly selling off assets and closing accounts in preparation for retirement. The total value of his estate after taxes and expenses amounted to $4.7 million, and he had left every penny of it to me. The silence in that office was deafening. I stared at Peterson in complete shock, unable to process the magnitude of what I was hearing. $4.7 million was more money than I could even conceptualize. My parents sat frozen in their chairs, their faces displaying a mixture of disbelief and barely controlled rage. Peterson continued reading, explaining that Samuel had established specific trust provisions to ensure the inheritance would be managed responsibly. I would have immediate access to funds for education expenses, reasonable living costs, and investment opportunities, but major expenditures would require approval from a trustee until I reached the age of 30 or demonstrated sufficient financial competence. The trustee Samuel had selected was not my parents, but rather Catherine Mills, a certified financial planner from Columbus, who specialized in inheritance management for young professionals. She had no family connections that might create conflicts of interest, and her fee structure was clearly defined in the trust documents. As Peterson finished reading and began explaining the next steps for probate processing, I noticed my parents exchanging meaningful looks across the office. Dad cleared his throat and asked several pointed questions about the timeline for distributing assets and whether any aspects of the will might be subject to legal challenge. Peterson responded with professional courtesy, but seemed surprised by the adversarial tone of these questions. He explained that Samuel's will was properly executed and witnessed with clear evidence of testamentary capacity at the time of signing. Unless there were extraordinary circumstances involving fraud or undue influence, the probate process should proceed smoothly within 6 months. My parents left the office without speaking to me, claiming they needed time to process this unexpected news. I stayed behind to ask Peterson about my responsibilities as the primary beneficiary and to understand the practical implications of Samuel's generosity. Peterson seemed pleased by my thoughtful questions and mentioned that Samuel had often spoken proudly of my educational achievements. The drive home was surreal as I tried to comprehend how completely my life had just changed. Financial security was no longer a concern, and I could finally pursue the legal career that had been delayed for the past 2 years. Samuel's gift would allow me to pay off student loans, establish a professional practice, and build the kind of future he had always encouraged me to pursue. I expected my parents to be happy about this dramatic improvement in our family's circumstances. Samuel's generosity would benefit all of us indirectly, and they had received substantial inheritance of their own. The house they had been struggling to maintain would now belong to them outright, and $50,000 each would provide significant financial cushion for their retirement planning. Instead, when I arrived home that evening, I found them huddled around the kitchen table with legal documents spread across the surface. They looked up with expressions I had never seen before, cold and calculating in a way that made my stomach clench with anxiety. Dad announced that they had retained Harrison Legal Group to explore their options regarding Samuel's will. They believed the inheritance distribution was unfair and potentially the result of undue influence on my part. A Harvard-educated grandson manipulating an elderly man's estate planning was exactly the kind of elder abuse that probate courts were designed to prevent. I was speechless. The idea that I had somehow coerced Samuel into leaving me money was absurd. I had never even known about his wealth, much less attempted to influence his estate planning. Our relationship had been built on genuine affection and shared interests, not financial calculation. Mom joined the attack by suggesting that my legal education had given me unfair advantages in manipulating family relationships for personal gain. She claimed that my frequent conversations with Samuel during his final years had been suspiciously focused on financial topics, though I knew this was completely false. They painted a picture of me as a calculating opportunist who had used emotional manipulation and legal knowledge to steal inheritance money that rightfully belonged to the entire family. According to their theory, Samuel's original intentions had been to distribute his wealth equally among all family members, but I had corrupted this plan through systematic influence over his decision-making. The transformation was so complete and sudden that I wondered if I was having some kind of nightmare. These were the same people who had raised me with love and values, who had celebrated my educational success, who had seemed proud of my character and judgment. Now they were painting me as a criminal mastermind who had been plotting against family interests for years. Within 48 hours, Harrison Legal Group had filed emergency motions in probate court challenging Samuel's will on grounds of lack of testamentary capacity and undue influence. They requested immediate freezing of all estate assets, pending a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding the will's execution and my relationship with Samuel during his final years. The legal papers were served at Millfield's restaurant during my lunch shift, creating a humiliating scene in front of customers and coworkers who had no idea about my family situation. The process server announced loudly that I was being sued by my own parents for inheritance fraud, ensuring that everyone in the restaurant heard the accusation. My manager Dave was understandably concerned about having an employee involved in high-profile legal disputes. He suggested I take some time off while the situation resolved itself, which effectively cost me my primary source of income at exactly the moment when I needed to hire legal representation. That evening, I discovered the sealed envelope Peterson had given me with instructions to open only if Thomas and Barbara contested the will. Samuel had somehow anticipated this exact scenario and prepared accordingly. His letter inside was both heartbreaking and illuminating. Samuel explained that he had discovered significant financial irregularities in his accounts over the past 2 years. Thomas and Barbara had been systematically transferring money to themselves using forged authorization documents and manipulated account access. They had stolen over $300,000 while he was dealing with health problems and reduced cognitive capacity. The USB drive contained recorded phone conversations where my parents discussed their long-term strategy for accessing Samuel's wealth through me while keeping me financially dependent and appearing unsuccessful. They had planned to challenge any inheritance I received using my deliberately sabotaged career as evidence of poor judgment and financial irresponsibility. Samuel's letter revealed that he had been aware of their manipulation tactics, but had chosen to document everything rather than confronting them directly. He wanted to protect me from their schemes while ensuring they faced legal consequences for their theft and fraud. The recordings were devastating in their casual cruelty. My parents laughed about the old fool trusting them with financial access while planning how to maximize their theft before his death. They discussed my career sabotage as if it were an entertaining game celebrating each missed opportunity and professional setback as progress toward their ultimate goal. Most painful was hearing them mock my loyalty and family devotion, treating my love for Samuel as a weakness to be exploited rather than a virtue to be respected. They had weaponized my best qualities against me while positioning themselves as victims of my supposed manipulation. As I listened to these recordings late into the night, any remaining hope for family reconciliation died completely. These people had never seen me as their beloved son, but rather as a tool for accessing wealth and achieving financial security at any cost. Their betrayal was total and unforgivable. The courthouse on the morning of our hearing buzzed with activity as various legal proceedings competed for courtroom space and public attention. I arrived early wearing my only decent suit and carrying a briefcase that contained my law school notes and the evidence Samuel had left for exactly this moment. The irony was not lost on me that I was about to represent myself in court after spending 2 years serving coffee and burgers instead of practicing law. Harrison Legal Group had assembled an impressive team for what should have been a routine probate matter. Marcus Harrison himself would be arguing the case supported by 2 junior associates and a paralegal who wheeled in boxes of documents and exhibits. Their strategy was clear: overwhelm the opposition with paperwork and aggressive advocacy while portraying me as an inexperienced young man and over his head. Judge Patricia Coleman presided over probate matters with a reputation for no-nonsense efficiency and little patience for family disputes. At 62, she had seen every possible variation of inheritance conflicts and had developed strong opinions about young people who felt entitled to wealth they had not earned. Her preliminary comments suggested she viewed this case as another example of generational greed corrupting family relationships. The gallery was packed with my parents' friends and neighbors, many of whom had known me since childhood, but now viewed me with suspicion and disappointment. They whispered among themselves as I took my seat at the defendant's table, clearly believing that Harvard had somehow corrupted my values and turned me against family loyalty. Marcus Harrison opened with a presentation that painted Samuel as a vulnerable, elderly man who had been systematically manipulated by a calculating grandson with legal training. He displayed charts showing Samuel's declining health, alongside my increasing presence in his daily life, suggesting a pattern of predatory behavior designed to influence estate planning decisions. The narrative Harrison constructed was compelling and emotionally powerful. According to his version of events, I had returned from Harvard with sophisticated knowledge of legal manipulation techniques and had targeted Samuel as an easy victim. My supposed failure to launch a legal career was actually evidence of my focus on the more lucrative strategy of inheritance theft. He emphasized my current employment as a waiter, arguing that someone with my educational background would never accept such menial work unless they were distracted by more important schemes. The fact that I remained financially dependent on my parents while living in their house demonstrated poor judgment and irresponsible decision-making that disqualified me from managing significant wealth. Harrison presented testimony from several family friends who described my close relationship with Samuel as unusually intense and possibly manipulative. They claimed to have noticed changes in Samuel's behavior and priorities after I began spending extended time with him, suggesting that I had been slowly undermining his judgment and isolating him from other family influences. When Thomas took the witness stand, his performance was devastating in its emotional impact and apparent sincerity. He described watching his beloved son transform from an idealistic young man into someone willing to exploit an elderly relative's vulnerability for personal gain. The pain in his voice seemed genuine as he recounted discovering the extent of Samuel's generosity toward me, while his own parents received relatively modest bequests. Thomas painted a picture of family gatherings where I would monopolize Samuel's attention, steering conversations toward financial topics and legal strategies. He claimed to have overheard me asking pointed questions about Samuel's business operations and asset management, suggesting that I was gathering intelligence for future inheritance manipulation. The most damaging part of Thomas's testimony involved his characterization of my relationship with Samuel as calculated and transactional rather than genuinely affectionate. He suggested that my frequent visits and lengthy conversations were motivated by greed rather than family love, and that Samuel had been too trusting and isolated to recognize the manipulation. Barbara's testimony was even more emotionally devastating. She cried as she described the son she thought she had raised someone who valued education and integrity above material success. The transformation she witnessed after Harvard graduation convinced her that academic achievement without moral grounding could create dangerous individuals capable of exploiting family relationships. She detailed specific conversations where I had supposedly pumped Samuel for information about his financial situation and business contacts. According to Barbara, I had been building a comprehensive understanding of Samuel's wealth while positioning myself as his primary emotional support and trusted advisor. Barbara's description of discovering the inheritance disparity was particularly powerful. She claimed to have been shocked not by the amount Samuel left me, but by the evidence that I had been working systematically to maximize my share while minimizing what other family members would receive. The inequality itself was less important than what it revealed about my character and methods. Marcus Harrison then presented financial analyses showing how quickly an inexperienced 28-year-old could lose $4.7 million through poor investment decisions or extravagant spending. He cited statistics about lottery winners and inheritance recipients who had squandered significant wealth within a few years of receiving it. The presentation included detailed projections showing various scenarios for how I might waste Samuel's life savings on luxury purchases, risky investments, or simply poor financial planning. Harrison argued that protecting this inheritance from my inexperience was exactly what Samuel would have wanted if he had understood the true risks involved. Judge Coleman seemed increasingly receptive to these arguments as the morning progressed. Her questions focused on my qualifications to manage complex financial assets and my track record of responsible decision-making. The fact that I had been unable to establish a successful legal career despite my Harvard education suggested fundamental problems with judgment and practical competence. The low point came when Judge Coleman asked me directly to explain why someone with my educational background deserved to inherit wealth that would take most people lifetimes to accumulate. Her tone was skeptical and condescending as she questioned whether a mere waiter could understand the complexities of investment management and financial planning. The gallery erupted in supportive murmurs for my parents, as Judge Coleman made increasingly pointed comments about book learning versus real-world competence. She seemed to view me as a perfect example of academic achievement without corresponding wisdom or maturity, exactly the kind of person who needed protection from their own poor judgment. What none of them knew was that my phone had been recording everything from inside my jacket pocket. Ohio law clearly permits recording of public court proceedings, and I had positioned my device to capture both audio and video of the entire hearing. Every biased comment from Judge Coleman and every perjured statement from my parents was being permanently documented. My Harvard training had taught me to recognize perjury when I heard it, and both Thomas and Barbara had made multiple false statements under oath. Their claims about my relationship with Samuel contradicted the documented evidence I possessed, and their characterization of their own knowledge about Samuel's finances was demonstrably untrue. More importantly, Judge Coleman's obvious bias and inappropriate commentary constituted clear judicial misconduct that would provide grounds for appeal and disciplinary action. Her personal opinions about waiters and Harvard graduates had no place in legal proceedings, and her failure to maintain judicial neutrality was being captured in real time. As my parents' testimony became more elaborate and emotionally manipulative, they were unknowingly digging themselves into deeper legal trouble. Each false statement under oath constituted a separate perjury charge, and their coordinated lies suggested conspiracy to commit fraud that would trigger federal prosecution. Marcus Harrison's aggressive presentation was also creating problems for his firm. His failure to adequately investigate his client's claims before presenting them in court violated ethical standards for legal representation. The evidence I possessed would demonstrate that he had either known about his client's perjury or had been grossly negligent in preparing their case. The courtroom atmosphere grew increasingly hostile as Judge Coleman encouraged my parents' supporters to express their disapproval of my supposed greed and manipulation. What should have been a neutral legal proceeding had become a public, shaming ritual designed to humiliate me into withdrawing my inheritance claim. But I remained calm and focused, knowing that every moment of this travesty was being recorded for future use. My Harvard education had prepared me for exactly this situation, and I understood both the legal principles involved and the procedural requirements for addressing judicial misconduct and perjury. The turning point was approaching rapidly, as Judge Coleman prepared to rule in favor of my parents without allowing me to present any defense evidence. Her mind was clearly made up based on bias and prejudice rather than facts and law, which would make the eventual reversal even more dramatic and satisfying. As I prepared to stand and address the court, I felt a strange sense of calm that comes from knowing you are absolutely right and have the evidence to prove it. The people who had betrayed me were about to discover that their carefully planned scheme had been built on a foundation of lies that would not withstand legal scrutiny. The moment arrived when Judge Coleman turned to me with barely concealed contempt and asked if I had anything to say in my defense before she ruled on my parents' motion to invalidate Samuel's will. The courtroom fell silent as every person present prepared to witness what they assumed would be my feeble attempt to justify inheriting money they believed I did not deserve. I stood slowly smoothing my tie and gathering my thoughts with the calm precision that Harvard had drilled into my consciousness during 3 years of intensive legal training. The irony of this moment was perfect. They had all dismissed me as an uneducated waiter, when in reality I possessed exactly the legal knowledge needed to demolish their case and expose their crimes. Your Honor, I began in a clear voice that carried throughout the packed courtroom. Before addressing the inheritance matter, I need to inform this court that I am Joseph Samuel Morrison, graduate of Harvard Law School, member of the Ohio State Bar, and I've been recording these proceedings in accordance with Ohio Revised Code Section 2709.03, which permits recording of public court sessions. The effect was immediate and electric. Judge Coleman's face drained of color as she processed the implications of what I had just announced. My parents looked confused and terrified as they realized their carefully constructed narrative had just collapsed. Marcus Harrison jumped to his feet, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. I continued with prosecutorial precision. The recording contains multiple instances of perjury by Thomas Morrison and Barbara Morrison, who testified under oath about matters they knew to be false. It also documents judicial misconduct by Your Honor, including inappropriate commentary about waiters and Harvard graduates that demonstrates clear bias incompatible with judicial neutrality. The courtroom erupted in chaos as people processed this devastating revelation. My parents' supporters, who had been smugly confident moments before now, whispered urgently among themselves as they realized the tables had completely turned. Judge Coleman frantically consulted with her clerk, while Marcus Harrison huddled with his associates in desperate damage control mode. Judge Coleman attempted to regain authority by demanding I stop recording immediately, but I calmly explained that her request constituted additional misconduct since she lacked legal authority to prohibit recording of public proceedings. I cited specific case law establishing citizen rights to document court activities, demonstrating the legal competence she had just finished mocking. Marcus Harrison finally found his voice and objected strenuously to my recording, claiming it violated attorney-client privilege and courtroom decorum. This objection revealed his own ignorance of basic legal principles, since no privilege applied to public testimony and recording rights were clearly established in Ohio law. I responded by explaining that Harrison's objection actually constituted evidence of his professional incompetence, since any attorney handling probate matters should understand basic procedural rules. His failure to research applicable law before making frivolous objections would be noted in my eventual complaint to the State Bar Association. The chaos intensified as Thomas and Barbara realized that their supposed lies under oath could result in criminal prosecution. Barbara began crying uncontrollably, while Thomas demanded to know how long I had been recording their private conversations. This question revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of the legal situation they had created for themselves. I explained that I possessed no private recordings, only documentation of their public perjury in open court. However, I did have extensive evidence of their criminal fraud against Samuel, which would be presented to appropriate authorities, regardless of how this probate matter concluded. Their inheritance challenge had actually provided the perfect opportunity to document additional crimes. Judge Coleman made a desperate attempt to declare a mistrial and seal all proceedings, but I politely informed her that such actions would constitute obstruction of justice, since criminal matters were now involved. Her continued misconduct was only making her eventual disciplinary hearing more serious and her resignation more inevitable. The gallery, which had been supportive of my parents throughout the morning, now watched in stunned silence as their friends transformed from sympathetic victims into criminal defendants. The social dynamics in our small community would never be the same after this public exposure of fraud and corruption. Marcus Harrison attempted to withdraw his objections and negotiate some kind of settlement, but I explained that criminal fraud could not be resolved through civil agreements. The evidence of systematic theft from Samuel's accounts would require federal prosecution since interstate banking transactions were involved. Thomas made a final desperate plea for family unity, suggesting we could work everything out privately without involving law enforcement. I responded that he had forfeited any claim to family consideration when he chose to publicly humiliate me based on lies and stolen evidence obtained through criminal fraud. Barbara collapsed completely, admitting between sobs that they owed gambling debts and needed money to avoid serious consequences from their creditors. This public confession of motive for their theft and fraud provided additional evidence for eventual criminal prosecution, demonstrating that their crimes were premeditated and systematic. Judge Coleman realized that her career was effectively over as news of her misconduct would spread throughout Ohio's legal community within hours. Probate judges who demonstrated bias and ignorance of basic law did not survive judicial retention elections, and her recorded comments would be replayed endlessly in legal education seminars. The courtroom had transformed from a place of legal proceedings into a crime scene, where multiple felonies had been documented and confessed. Bailiffs began making phone calls to notify appropriate authorities, while I calmly organized my evidence for presentation to prosecutors. I explained to the stunned assembly that Samuel had anticipated exactly this scenario and had prepared comprehensive documentation of his parents' crimes specifically to protect me from their manipulation. His foresight and planning had ensured that justice would be served despite their elaborate schemes. The recording would be transcribed and submitted to the Ohio Supreme Court's Disciplinary Commission, along with a formal complaint against Judge Coleman. Marcus Harrison's firm would face ethics violations for inadequate client screening and presentation of known perjury. Thomas and Barbara would face federal fraud charges with mandatory prison sentences. As the reality of their situation sank in, my parents' supporters began quietly leaving the courtroom to avoid association with the unfolding scandal. The social ostracism they had intended for me would instead fall on Thomas and Barbara as their crimes became public knowledge throughout our community. The inheritance dispute had become irrelevant in the face of criminal charges that would consume my parents' lives for years to come. Samuel's will would be probated normally while they dealt with federal prosecutors, and the destruction of their reputations and freedom. Justice was being served in real time as the people who had betrayed me faced immediate consequences for their crimes and lies. The legal system they had tried to manipulate was now crushing them with the full weight of evidence and law, exactly as Samuel had planned and I had executed. The atmosphere in that courtroom had shifted from confident prosecution to desperate damage control as I methodically presented the evidence that would destroy my parents' case and their freedom. Judge Coleman sat frozen behind her bench, realizing that every word she spoke was being recorded for future use in her inevitable disciplinary hearing. The power dynamic had completely reversed, with the supposed victim now controlling the narrative and outcome. I opened my briefcase and withdrew Samuel's meticulously organized documentation, explaining to the stunned assembly that my grandfather had been investigating his own financial accounts for over 2 years after noticing suspicious activity. As a successful businessman, Samuel understood the importance of maintaining detailed records and had documented every instance of unauthorized access to his money. The bank statements I displayed showed a clear pattern of systematic theft beginning shortly after Samuel's first heart episode 18 months before his death. Thomas and Barbara had used their power of attorney, originally granted for legitimate emergency purposes, to transfer money into accounts they controlled without Samuel's knowledge or consent. The amounts were staggering in their scope and frequency. Initial transfers of $5,000 and $10,000 had escalated to regular monthly withdrawals of $25,000 each, totaling over $300,000 in stolen funds. The progression showed increasing boldness as they became confident that Samuel would not notice or investigate their theft. Samuel's documentation included photocopies of forged authorization letters, where Thomas and Barbara had copied his signature onto fraudulent documents. Handwriting analysis would easily prove these forgeries, and the bank's security cameras had recorded them making transactions with obviously fake identification and authorization papers. More devastating was the USB drive containing recorded phone conversations, where my parents discussed their crimes with casual indifference to Samuel's well-being or trust. I connected my laptop to the courtroom's audio system and played selected excerpts that demonstrated their premeditated fraud and complete lack of remorse. The first recording captured Thomas laughing about how easy it was to fool the old man into giving them financial access. He described Samuel as a trusting fool who deserved to be taken advantage of because he had been too successful for too long. The cruelty and contempt in Thomas's voice shocked everyone present, including Judge Coleman. Barbara's voice was equally damning as she discussed their gambling debts and plans to increase their theft before Samuel became suspicious. She expressed no guilt about stealing from someone who had treated them as family, only concern about maximizing their take before discovery became inevitable. The recordings revealed their long-term strategy for manipulating the inheritance situation through systematic sabotage of my career prospects. They discussed specific actions they had taken to prevent me from establishing financial independence, including intercepting job offers and discouraging professional networking activities. Most shocking was their discussion of my loyalty and family devotion as weaknesses to be exploited rather than qualities to be respected. They laughed about how easy it was to manipulate someone who actually cared about family relationships, treating my love for Samuel as ammunition for their schemes. The evidence also included detailed plans for challenging any inheritance I received using my deliberately sabotaged career as proof of poor judgment. They had calculated exactly how long to keep me financially dependent while building a record of apparent failure that would support their legal challenge. Marcus Harrison attempted to interrupt the presentation by claiming the recordings were illegally obtained, but I explained that Samuel had recorded conversations in his own home with people who were stealing his money. Ohio law clearly permitted such recordings when documenting ongoing crimes, and the evidence would be admissible in criminal proceedings. Judge Coleman tried to maintain some authority by questioning the relevance of these recordings to the inheritance dispute, but I pointed out that the evidence directly contradicted my parents' sworn testimony about their knowledge of Samuel's finances and their motives for challenging his will. The final blow came when I played recordings of Thomas and Barbara discussing their plans to split Samuel's inheritance among themselves after successfully challenging my claim. They had already spent money they planned to steal, running up additional gambling debts based on anticipated access to Samuel's wealth. Their scheme was comprehensive and calculated, involving years of preparation and systematic criminal activity. This was not a spontaneous reaction to unexpected inheritance news, but rather the culmination of a long-term plan to steal Samuel's entire estate while destroying my life in the process. As the evidence mounted, Marcus Harrison realized that his firm faced serious ethical violations for failing to investigate their client's credibility before presenting knowingly false testimony. He attempted to withdraw from representation immediately, but I explained that abandoning clients in the middle of proceedings would only compound his professional problems. The gallery watched in horrified fascination as my parents transformed from sympathetic victims into exposed criminals facing federal prosecution. Their friends and neighbors began to understand that they had been manipulated into supporting elaborate fraud schemes disguised as family disputes. Thomas made a desperate attempt to minimize the damage by claiming they had only borrowed money with intentions of paying it back eventually. This explanation was immediately contradicted by recorded conversations where he explicitly discussed permanent theft with no plans for repayment or disclosure. Barbara's emotional breakdown intensified as she realized that their gambling addiction had destroyed not only their own lives, but also their relationship with me and their standing in the community. The social consequences would be devastating even beyond the criminal charges they would face. I explained that federal prosecutors would be interested in this case because the theft involved interstate banking transactions and systematic fraud patterns that suggested organized criminal activity. The amounts involved and duration of the scheme would result in mandatory minimum prison sentences. The evidence also demonstrated that Thomas and Barbara had committed multiple counts of perjury during their testimony earlier that morning. Each false statement under oath constituted a separate felony charge, and their coordinated lies proved conspiracy to commit fraud. Judge Coleman's situation was equally dire, as her recorded bias and misconduct would result in disciplinary action and likely removal from the bench. Her inappropriate comments about waiters and Harvard graduates revealed prejudices incompatible with judicial office and her failure to maintain courtroom neutrality. The inheritance dispute itself had become a minor issue compared to the criminal charges that would consume my parents' lives for years to come. Samuel's will would be probated normally while they dealt with federal prosecution and the complete destruction of their reputations and freedom. As I concluded my presentation, the courtroom remained silent, except for Barbara's continued sobbing and the sound of people quietly leaving to avoid further association with the unfolding scandal. The social dynamics in our community would be permanently altered by this public exposure of fraud and betrayal. The legal system my parents had tried to manipulate was now crushing them with overwhelming evidence and clear violations of federal criminal law. Samuel's foresight and planning had ensured that justice would be served, despite their elaborate schemes to steal his life's work and destroy my future. 6 months have passed since that devastating day in Judge Coleman's courtroom, and the transformation in my life has been as dramatic as it was necessary. I am writing this from my new office at Richardson Hayes & Associates in Columbus, where I work as a junior associate specializing in estate planning and elder law. The irony is not lost on me that my parents' betrayal led directly to the legal career I'd been seeking all along. Thomas and Barbara pleaded guilty to federal fraud charges after their legal team advised them that fighting the overwhelming evidence would only result in harsher sentences. Thomas received 3 years in federal prison, plus full restitution of the stolen funds. Barbara received 2.5 years due to her cooperation with investigators and genuine remorse for their actions. The restitution order required them to sell the house on Maple Street that Samuel had left them along with all their possessions of value. Even after liquidating everything they owned, they fell short of the full amount stolen from Samuel's accounts. The remaining debt will follow them for the rest of their lives, ensuring they never financially benefit from their crimes. Judge Patricia Coleman resigned in disgrace after the Ohio Supreme Court's Disciplinary Commission reviewed the recordings of her misconduct. Her inappropriate comments and obvious bias violated fundamental principles of judicial neutrality, making her position untenable once the evidence became public. She now works as a legal clerk at a small firm outside Columbus, her judicial career permanently destroyed. Marcus Harrison's firm faced serious sanctions from the Ohio State Bar Association for their failure to adequately investigate client claims before presenting them in court. Harrison himself received a 6-month suspension and mandatory ethics training, while his firm paid substantial fines and implemented new client screening procedures. The story of the courtroom confrontation spread throughout Ohio's legal community, becoming a cautionary tale about the importance of thorough case preparation and ethical client representation. Law schools now use recordings of the proceeding in their professional responsibility courses as an example of how quickly careers can be destroyed by cutting corners. Samuel's will was probated without further challenge, and I received the full inheritance he had intended for me. Catherine Mills. The financial advisor Samuel selected as trustee helped me invest the funds responsibly while maintaining enough liquidity to pay for law school debt and professional development expenses. My new colleagues at Richardson Hayes and Associates were impressed by the legal skills I had demonstrated during the inheritance dispute. The managing partner, Robert Richardson, offered me a position after reviewing news coverage of the case and recognizing the potential value of someone who understood both legal principles and the personal dynamics of family conflicts. The work I do now involves protecting other elderly clients from exactly the kind of exploitation my parents attempted against Samuel. Estate planning and elder law require understanding both legal technicalities and family psychology skills I developed through painful personal experience with betrayal and manipulation. I used part of Samuel's inheritance to establish the Samuel Morrison Scholarship Fund at Ohio State University, providing financial assistance for first-generation college students who demonstrate academic excellence and financial need. The scholarship honors Samuel's memory while helping deserving students achieve educational goals without the crushing debt that makes them vulnerable to family manipulation. The legal aid component of Samuel's legacy focuses on providing free representation for families facing inheritance disputes and elder abuse situations. Too many people lack the resources to fight systematic fraud and manipulation, leaving criminals free to exploit vulnerable family members without consequences. Working with these clients has taught me that Samuel's situation was far from unique. Adult children stealing from elderly parents represents a growing problem as lifespans increase and family structures become more complex. The legal system often fails to protect victims because families are reluctant to prosecute relatives even when crimes are obvious and serious. The most rewarding aspect of my current work is helping families rebuild trust and communication after betrayal and exploitation have damaged relationships. Not every case ends with criminal prosecution, but all of them require careful attention to both legal and emotional healing processes. My relationship with Thomas and Barbara remains permanently severed, and I have no plans for reconciliation, even after they complete their prison sentences. Some betrayals are too fundamental and calculated to forgive, especially when they involve systematic manipulation and public humiliation designed to destroy someone's future prospects. The friends I have made among my colleagues and clients represent the genuine family relationships that Samuel always encouraged me to seek. People who respect integrity and character provide much better foundation for meaningful connections than blood relatives who view family members as opportunities for exploitation and financial gain. My dating life has improved significantly since moving to Columbus and establishing my legal career. Professional women appreciate dating someone with clear values and career ambition, rather than someone whose life appears stagnant and directionless. The confidence that comes from surviving betrayal and achieving justice makes me more attractive and interesting to potential partners. The restaurant staff at Millfields threw a celebration party when news of my legal victory spread through Springfield. They understood better than anyone how my parents had been systematically undermining my self-confidence and professional prospects, while pretending to offer loving support and guidance. Dave, my former manager, admitted he had always suspected I was overqualified for waiting tables, but respected my apparent family loyalty. He said watching me stand up to public humiliation and legal intimidation inspired other employees who were dealing with their own family manipulation and pressure. The regular customers who had known me as just Joey the waiter were shocked to learn about my Harvard education and legal training. Several approached me after the court case to apologize for believing my parents' characterization of me as lazy and unmotivated rather than recognizing signs of systematic sabotage. Living independently in Columbus has restored my sense of personal agency and control over my future direction. The apartment I rent is modest but comfortable, and coming home each evening to space that belongs entirely to me provides psychological healing that continues every day. Samuel's wisdom guides my decisions now more than ever. His recorded warnings about my parents' character proved accurate, But more importantly, his teachings about integrity and personal strength carried me through the darkest period of my life. He prepared me not just financially, but morally for the challenges I would face. The legal profession has welcomed me with respect and recognition that I never experienced while working at Millfields. Colleagues treat me as an equal whose opinions and insights have value rather than someone whose education and potential are being wasted through poor personal choices. My Harvard classmates who had lost touch during my years in Springfield reached out to offer support and networking opportunities once news of my situation became public. The legal community is small enough that stories of dramatic courtroom confrontations spread quickly, especially when they involve impressive demonstrations of legal knowledge and preparation. The continuing education seminars I now attend regularly provide professional development that my parents had systematically prevented during my time in Springfield. Building expertise in estate planning and elder law requires staying current with changing regulations and emerging fraud tactics that target vulnerable populations. Looking back on that terrible day in Judge Coleman's courtroom, I realized it represented the most important moment of my adult life. Everything that seemed designed to destroy me actually provided the foundation for achieving genuine success and personal satisfaction beyond anything I had previously imagined possible. Samuel's final gift was not just financial security, but the opportunity to discover my own strength and character under pressure. He knew that surviving betrayal and fighting for justice would teach lessons about integrity and resilience that no classroom or textbook could provide. The inheritance money continues growing through careful investment management, ensuring that future generations of students will benefit from scholarship opportunities that honor Samuel's memory. Creating something positive and lasting from such a painful experience provides meaning that transcends personal satisfaction. My current clients often express amazement at my ability to understand their emotional struggles while providing competent legal representation. Personal experience with family betrayal and systematic manipulation gives me insights that purely academic legal training could never provide. The most profound lesson from this entire experience involves the difference between genuine family relationships and mere biological connections. Samuel demonstrated unconditional love and support throughout my life, while Thomas and Barbara revealed their willingness to destroy me for financial gain when opportunity arose. True family consists of people who celebrate your success and support your dreams rather than those who undermine your confidence and sabotage your opportunities while claiming to act from love and concern for your well-being. Justice was served not through revenge but through refusing to compromise my principles despite devastating personal cost. Samuel's guidance helped me choose truth over comfort, integrity over convenience, and legal process over emotional manipulation. The strength I discovered during those dark months continues serving me well in professional and personal relationships. Surviving systematic betrayal by people I trusted completely proved that I can handle whatever challenges life presents while maintaining my values and self-respect. Samuel's grave has become a place of gratitude rather than mourning, where I visit regularly to share news of professional achievements and personal growth that his sacrifice made possible. His headstone bears an inscription that captures his essential message: character is proven when everything you trusted falls apart and you still choose to do what is right. That message guides every decision I make and every relationship I build, ensuring that Samuel's legacy of integrity and courage continues through my work and the lives I touch through legal representation and scholarship opportunities. The pain of family betrayal never completely heals, but it transforms into wisdom that protects against future manipulation while enabling me to help others navigate similar challenges with dignity and strength. Have you ever faced a situation where people you trusted completely betrayed that trust for personal gain? How did you find the strength to fight back when everything seemed stacked against you? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe for more content about overcoming life's biggest challenges, and share it with anyone who might need inspiration to stand up for themselves when facing overwhelming odds. Thank you for taking this journey with me. And remember that no matter how dark things seem, maintaining your integrity and fighting for truth will always lead to better outcomes than compromising your values for temporary peace. Until next time, stay strong and never stop believing in your own worth.